The sharp-eyed reader of Chaim Weizmann's Trial and Error will notice among the first entries in the index of the first President of Israel's autobiography a reference to Aberystwyth University College. As I'm recording this talk in lockdown, with Aberystwyth University's campus clearly visible and glittering in the sunshine outside the window, I thought I'd use the occasion to talk briefly about Weizmann's Aberystwyth network. Now, I'm not going to claim that this small seaside university town in West Wales played a defining role in the establishment of the Jewish national home in Palestine, but it does, I think, merit an intriguing footnote, not least because of its centrality in the establishment of a new discipline of international relations, a discipline which, in its liberal intellectual origins, was closely connected to and deeply sympathetic with Zionist aspirations in the years either side of the San Remo Conference. On the 19th of September 1917, less than 2 months before the Balfour Declaration was issued, a letter from David Davis, the Welsh Liberal MP for Montgomeryshire and Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, was published in the Times. Criticising the War Office's reluctance to formally designate an official Jewish identity or insignia to the newly formed 38th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, better known as the Jewish Legion, Davis issued the following message to what he called his Zionist friends. "Let them not be discouraged," he said. "Zionism is a worldwide force. It represents all that is noblest in Jewry. Surely, then, it is the duty of the Allies to attract this powerful agency to their side, to show that we are in the fullest sympathy with its ideals, and to encourage its followers to enlist in a cause which we have made our own, the redemption of Palestine and the Jewish colonies from the brutal tyranny of the Turks. Goliath may have won the first round. There still remains David and his brethren. Try David." In 1919, arguably the foundational moment in the discipline of international relations, Davis endowed a new chair in international politics at Aberystwyth University, both as a memorial to the students killed and wounded in the Great War and as a product of his own determination to contribute to the creation of a new world order characterised by international cooperation, organisation, justice and law. It's a little-known part of the history of post-war liberal internationalism and idealism that, in 1926, Aberystwyth actually hosted an annual meeting of the International Federation of League of Nations Societies, joining a distinguished list of diplomatic centres, along with Paris, London, Geneva, Brussels, Vienna, Berlin and The Hague. The first holder of Davis's new chair in international politics was Alfred Zimmern, a wartime member of the Foreign Office's Political Intelligence Department and part of Alfred Milner's so-called Round Table Group, which was described by Weizmann's biographer Norman Rose as a cluster of high-minded imperialists who straddled the worlds of academia and politics. It was Zimmern in 1919 who drafted the memorandum that formed the basis of the League of Nations, and he remained an important advisor both to Whitehall and the League itself throughout the 1920s. Weizmann was on close terms with Zimmern, and Zimmern in turn took a favourable view of Zionism and was profoundly influenced by some of its leading thinkers. He had established a close friendship with Harry Sacker during the pair's undergraduate days at New College, Oxford, and Sacker's work for the Manchester Guardian brought him into contact with C.P. Scott. Ronald Sanders has identified Zimmern as the possible author of the Manchester Guardian's first outright statement of support for Zionism in an article entitled "Jews and the War," published on the 25th of June 1915. In March 1920, shortly before the San Remo Conference, Zimmern contributed a fascinating introduction to Leon Simon's collection of essays, Studies in Jewish Nationalism, which stands as a testimony to the influence of Zionist thought on his own developing ideas about the role of nationalism within international politics. Simon, a Zionist activist who had contributed to the drafting of the Balfour Declaration, was a distinguished scholar in his own right, and the long-standing English translator and advocate for the writings of Asher Ginsburg, better known as Achad Ha'am, leading proponent of cultural Zionism. Zimmern's friendship with Simon dated back to his Oxford University days and encounters with an Oxford-based group of English Zionists, of which both Simon and Sacker were prominent members. Zimmern would later recall how his interest in Jewish nationalism was fired by discussions among this circle, and how this led him in 1905 to attend the 7th Zionist Congress at Basel, Switzerland. Among the bookstalls at that conference, Zimmern discovered the writings of Achad Ha'am. It is plain truth to say, Zimmern wrote, that the ideas developed in the course of years of unhappily too intermittent discussion and intercourse with the English interpreters of Achad Ha'am, of whom Leon Simon is the foremost, have influenced me in steadily increasing measure ever since. Achad Ha'am's conception of nationalism, he continued, had identified a profound truth, and the perplexity and rancour under which the European peoples are labouring today, he continued, would be cleared away as if by magic if the simple teaching on nationality and kindred spirits had become, as I believe it is destined to become in the future, the common property of the civilized world. In relation to both Chaim and Simon's writings on Zionism, and to this we might add by extension Weizmann himself, Zimmern professed himself to be a grateful disciple. Dr. Mark Levine, author of one of the most interesting revisionist articles on the origins of the Balfour Declaration, as well as a fascinating history of the wartime diplomacy of the Anglo-Jewish anti-Zionist communal leader Lucien Wolfe, has identified Zimmern as a key intellectual influence on the New Europe group, whose liberal nationalist views on the post-war settlement had begun to define British war aims by the end of 1916. As part of the Foreign Office's Political Intelligence Department, Zimmern was among those formulating a policy based on the total defeat of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and crucially for our purposes, Turkey, as well as the application to those defeated empires of the principles of self-determination that would provide the framework for the creation of new nation-states. Here, Zimmern's combination of an idealistic internationalism with a more pragmatic assessment of the modern forces of nationalism was very clearly influenced by his encounter with the writings of Ahmad Chaim. His interest in nationalism, particularly the identities and rights of small nations, was, as my friend Jasmine Donaghy has shown, an intellectual focus that Zimmern carried with him throughout and indeed beyond his tenure in the appropriately named Woodrow Wilson Chair at Aberystwyth. Zimmern would later forge a close political relationship with Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, whose support for the Jewish national home can be seen in his 1922 pamphlet, A Socialist in Palestine, as well as his 1925 memoir, Wanderings and Excursions. As a supporter of MacDonald's National Labour, Zimmern was also able to exert influence upon figures like Arthur Balfour's niece Blanche Dugdale, an outstanding example, Norman Rose described her, of Gentile Zionism, and who met with Zimmern to discuss matters of foreign policy during the interwar years. Zimmern's successor as the second Wilson Professor of International Politics was Charles Kingsley Webster. Webster's links to the leadership of the Zionist movement are even more straightforward to discern. Weizmann himself in his memoirs would later recall how Zionist work thrust itself insistently into my labours at the Admiralty. There's not enough room in this record for more than a passing allusion to most of the thoroughly interesting, sometimes rather extraordinary personalities who played a part in that phase of Zionist history. Some of them, however, it is impossible to dismiss offhand. Weizmann would go on to list those who, 30 years later, he counted as having contributed most significantly to the events surrounding the establishment of the Jewish national home. Charles Webster was among them. Weizmann described him as exceptionally gifted. Later, he became Professor of International Relations at Aberystwyth. He travelled much in Japan, India and Asia Minor, and knew the Near East well. He was a devoted friend of the Zionist movement. Leonard Stein, author of perhaps the most authoritative history of the Balfour Declaration, drew on Webster's own writings to make the argument that Weizmann's familiarity with and his appeal, or his ability to appeal to specifically British characteristics, enabled him to advance the Zionist cause. Of the able and active men, some with a lifetime's devotion to the Zionist cause behind them, Webster observed, many had little connection with Britain and were not very proficient in the English language. In some cases, their very zeal was an embarrassment. And since they knew very little of the mysterious processes of British government, they were apt to say and do things which hindered rather than forwarded the cause they had at heart. Weizmann, Webster concluded, was a very different political animal. With unerring skill, he adapted his arguments to the special circumstances of each statesman. Mr. Lloyd George was told that Palestine was a little country not unlike Wales. To me, who dealt with these matters as a junior officer of the General Staff, he brought from many sources all the evidence that could be obtained of the importance of a Jewish national home to the strategical position of the British Empire. Webster's association with Weizmann and the Zionist movement did not end with his War Office intelligence research on Palestine and his political liaison work between the War Office, the Foreign Office, at the Paris Peace Conference. Indeed, perhaps the most interesting source for Webster's views on Weizmann and Jewish nationalism comes from a rather later period. In 1955, Webster was invited to Israel by Mayor Weizgall, chairman of the Executive Council and later president of the Weizmann Institute, to deliver the inaugural Weizmann Lecture for the Humanities. As Weizgall later explained, in 1950 we began to build the Weizmann Archive. I conferred with leading scholars and friends of Weizmann, notably Isaiah Berlin, Leonard Stein, Louis Namier, and Charles Webster, who later came to be known as the Implementation Committee. All were giants in their fields. Sir Charles was an historian and professor of international relations, a barrister and writer who had been an admirer of Weizmann since the Peace Conference in Paris in 1919. Webster thus acquired a position close to the status of official historian of Weizmann, and in his 1955 lecture, the founder of the National Home, the lecture took the form of a prolonged tribute to Weizmann's political achievement. A couple of passages are worth quoting at length. No one will dispute, he wrote, that Dr Weizmann was the main creator of the Jewish national home, and without the national home there could have been no state of Israel today. But even I now doubt whether this part of his great achievements has ever received in contemporary history all the recognition that it deserves. It was, in my opinion, the greatest act of diplomatic statesmanship of the First World War. That period produced several great leaders of small nationalities who obtained much for their peoples when the world was transformed by the conflict between the great powers, but none of them, in my view, not even the two most renowned amongst them, Masaryk and Venizelos, can compare in stature with Dr Weizmann. Their peoples were already in physical possession of territories to which these principles of self-determination and democratic government could be applied. But Dr Weizmann had no such advantage. The people for whom he strove were dispersed over all 5 continents. Webster thus placed Weizmann's Zionism in the same tradition of emergent nationalisms which his predecessor Zimmern had done much to promote within British diplomatic circles. It was obvious, he declared, that as the war went on, Britain would apply to the Ottoman Empire the same weapon of attack which the Entente powers applied to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, namely nationalism. Webster went on to comment specifically on the San Remo Conference and the confirmation of the establishment of a British-controlled Palestine, in which, consequently, a national home was bound to be established. That result, he said, could not have come about had not the Zionist Organization under Dr Weizmann's leadership obtained the support of the great majority of the Jews of the world and shown that they were both ready and capable of undertaking the tremendous task of transforming Palestine so that it really could contain a national home for the Jewish people. Had it not existed, nearly 500,000 more Jews would have been involved in the most terrible calamity of our time. A couple of concluding thoughts. Firstly, there was certainly nothing inevitable about Zimmern and Webster, academics engaged in wartime political intelligence about the Middle East, gravitating towards the sympathies for Jewish nationalism that they so evidently came to display. The best evidence of this comes in the person of Arnold J. Toynbee, another historian within the political intelligence department and who, like Webster, served as a delegate at the Paris Peace Conference. Toynbee, as is well known, moved in a very different intellectual direction. His A Study of History, published between 1934 and 1961, produced instead what Abba Eban has characterized as a study of the rise and fall of civilizations that presents the story of Israel over thousands of years as a grotesque aberration leading to a tragedy of historic injustice. Toynbee's Judeophobia expressed itself notoriously in his description of the Jewish people as a fossil remnant. It was amply clear, for Eban at least, that Toynbee harboured a fierce resentment against Jewish survival and still more against Jewish restoration. And I'll just note in passing that Abba Eban, in October 1988, would himself join the distinguished list of scholars and statesmen to have delivered the annual David Davis Memorial Lecture. The influence and legacy of David Davis thus continued and continues to make itself felt long after the formal establishment of Israel. The establishment of the Jewish national home in Palestine was certainly a cause to which Davis remained committed to the end of his life. In March 1942, 2 years before his own death, he took it upon himself to remonstrate with the Colonial Office about what he viewed as Britain's retreat from its commitment to support for the Jewish national home. Addressing the Colonial Secretary, Robert Gascoigne Cecil, Viscount Cranbourne, Davis delivered a passionate cri de coeur against what he saw as the betrayal by the British authorities in Palestine of the commitment to support for Jewish national aspirations. "Oh, how I wish I could persuade you," he wrote, "that our attitude to the Jews in Palestine is the supreme test of the sincerity of our professions and our war aims. Our calamities and losses in the Far East are due to the attitude we assumed towards China ever since Manchukuo. It destroyed any moral influence we might have had in the Far East because we had cold-shouldered our friends, those who were actually fighting our battle, in order to appease our enemies. Fundamentally, we are pursuing the same policy in Palestine, and unless it is speedily reversed, I am convinced that the Malaya tragedy will be reenacted in the Middle East. I trust I may be wrong, and that Russia will be able to prevent Hitler from undertaking the invasion of Syria and Palestine. But in the meantime, my friend, it seems to me that you are running a terrible risk. Why? Because your predecessors and their representatives in Palestine, in spite of all that has happened elsewhere, have been and still are obsessed with this idea of appeasement. That is the path leading to destruction, and I pray God that your footsteps may be diverted from it."